couple of weeks ago, I ran a workshop at the Devops Playground looking at how we could use Amazon's fault injection service to test the resilience of our infrastructure. Now, the day before the workshop, Amazon released some new functionality that let you use FIS to test Lambdas. And I said I'd put together an update to share how we could use that, how well it worked. And here we are. So let's have a look at the new functionality. Let's see what we can do with it. And let's jump in. Now, one thing to be aware of is that there have been some changes to the AWS console since we ran that workshop. So if you look at that and then come to this, you'll probably notice there are a few minor differences in how that screen looks as we're working through. But the functionality is the same. It's just a slightly different look and feel. Now, the code that we're going to be following in the workshop is available in a GitHub repository. I'll put the link up on the screen now. So if you want to clone the code from that repository and follow along as we did in the workshop, and what we're going to do is we're going to jump to step 4. And we have a README in place. Now, you will need some prerequisites. You will need an AWS account that you're logged into. You'll also need a CLI session set up with some credentials. You can see on the screen that I've got that here. I've got a terminal session logged in VS Code, and I've got a README that I'm going to follow along as we go through this workshop. The steps are all in here, so you can read and follow along as we go. Okay, so let's have a look at the workshop and what it is that we're going to do. The first thing we're going to do is build out some infrastructure, and we're going to use Terraform to do this. Now, the infrastructure that we're going to build out inside our account, I'm using EUS2, but as long as you choose a region where FIS exists, you can use that as well. It's going to look something like this. We're going to build a Lambda function, which will deploy. It's going to be a simple function. All it's going to do is list whatever S3 buckets exist in our account. There's going to be a role that the Lambda will use to provide the permissions. And we're also going to set up a bucket that we will use in conjunction with FIS to pass information between, and we'll explain how this works towards the end of the workshop. We're also going to set up a role that FIS will use when it's running the experiment. Okay, so let's get started. So what we need to do is we need to clone the repository if you haven't done already and CD into it. And what we need to do is make sure that we are in the Devops Playground folder where we've cloned the code. We want to go into steps, step 04. And the first thing we need to do is initialize our environment. And to do this, we run a command called Terraform init. What this will do is this is going to go down, pull the providers that we need for our Terraform. Okay. In here, there are a number of Terraform files. Feel free to look at this, but basically they're going to deploy this infrastructure that I've described, and you can see in that diagram above. And what we need to do is let's copy this command. Now, one thing you'll need to do is there is a file called common.tf-vars. You'll find that in the common folder, and that has the name of a role that we'll use whilst we're executing this workshop. Just set this to whatever name you want. In this case, I've set mine to Funky, and we use this when we run the workshop normally, so we don't get any name clashes. So let me copy that command, and we will paste that in. And that's going to run through and deploy that infrastructure. This just takes a minute or so to deploy all the items that we need. And when it's complete, we should finish with some output that looks something like this. Now, it's worthwhile noticing these outputs here. One is the name of the role name that is created that we'll use when we run the FIS experiments. And it's also output the name here of the Lambda that it's created as part of that Terraform deploy. Okay, with that in place, let's switch to our AWS console and we'll carry on. Okay, so we've deployed our infrastructure using the Terraform. Let's start by looking at the Lambda that we've created. So if we select Lambda in the console, my username that I'd set up was funky. I know that this is the Step04 experiment that we're running, so this is my Lambda here. If we click on this, we can see our Lambda function. So in the code section here, we can see the code that the Lambda has deployed. And as I say, this is some simple code. It just lists the buckets in our account and outputs it. So let's have a look at this and try running the code so we see how it runs as we'd normally expect. Now, to do that, we'll need to create a test event. So click on Create Test Event down here. We'll put a name in here. I'll call it Test Event. You can use whatever name you want, and it doesn't matter what the data is that we're going to use for the testing. We don't use that in the Lambda, so we'll take the example code that it's got in here. We'll click on Save. Tells us our event has been saved successfully, so we can close that section, close the notification at the top, and what we'll do is we will click on Test. Choose that test event that we just created. And we can see the output section down here. Now, in this particular case, we can see the buckets that it's listed, and there's some statistics about the runtime of the Lambda as well. So our Lambda's working as we'd expect it to, which is good. So with the Lambda in place, let's look at putting in place an FIS experiment that we can use to test this. So we could do this in a couple of different ways. We could just search for FIS in here. Let's do that. I'm going to open this in a new tab just so I can switch back to Lambda once we've finished creating the experiment template. Okay, let's open up the FIS screen. What I'm going to do is come down to experiment templates over here, and I'm going to click on create an experiment template. Okay, so let's create a template that we can use to test this Lambda. First of all, let's put a description in here. Let's call this Lambda. Put a name in there that we recognize. Don't put any spaces in there. And I'm going to keep it that this is running this account. We're not going to do cross-account experiments today. Once that's in place, we'll click on Next. And the first thing that we want to do is to choose our action. So click on Add Action. We'll put a name in here. Again, no spaces. Let's call this Delay Function. I can either come to here and choose Lambda, or I can come into the action type and I can search for Lambda. And what we're going to do is we're going to add a delay, as it says there. Adds delay to the start of a function invocation. So this is a simple one that we can use to test this. Come down to duration. We'll set this to 3 minutes. And let's set the startup delay to 35,000. So that's going to give us 35 seconds of delay. We'll save that. As before, it's put our target in, but we need to tell the target which of the Lambdas it needs to target. So we'll click on that. You see that we have Lambda function already selected. If you don't have that, make sure you have it in place. Come down and we need to tell it which Lambda we want to actually target when we run the experiment. We're just going to give it the name of the Lambda that we've created it. So come down to Add New ARN, use the drop down, and I know that this is the Step04 Lambda that I created, so I'll select that. I don't need to put anything else into this particular dialog box, so we'll save. Okay, that's the action and the target defined. So move on to our next screen. I need to choose the role that we're going to use to run the experiment. This was created in the Terraform as well. So if I go down here, I can see step 04, FIS IAM role. That's the one we want to use. Next, we'll leave these optional settings alone. Click on next again, and we'll just review what it is that we've created. So we've got our name, we've got a description, what it is that we're going to do, and the target, the role that we're going to use. This all looks good. If there are any changes that you need to make, you can use the previous to take you back into the screens and make those changes. But for now, let's click on Create Experiment Template. It's going to ask us to confirm this as it did in the previous steps. So let's click on Create and create an experiment template. So we've created a template there that is going to give us an experiment that will run for 3 minutes. And during that 3 minutes, if we invoke the Lambda that we specified, it's going to introduce the delay. So let's give that a try. Let's click on Start Experiment. And again, it asks us to confirm this. Click Start. We can see that it's initiating the experiment here. And now it's running. Okay, so let's leave that there and switch back to our Lambda. So let's try executing that Lambda again whilst the experiment is running. We're just going to click on test. We're going to choose the test event. And this time you'll notice that we're getting these executions started. Now remember that we set the delay in our experiment to run for 35 seconds. So what we can see is this is definitely taking a lot longer to start this time. And what we can actually see here is that this time when we've tried to run that Lambda, the task is timed out. Now we configured this Lambda to have a timeout of 30 seconds. We'd put a delay in there for 35 seconds and that's exceeded the timeout. So we could use this experiment to make sure that we set appropriate timeout periods. And maybe we're going to trigger an alarm if our Lambda terminates before it successfully completes. Okay, so we've demonstrated that we can use the experiment to alter the way that our Lambda runs. So our experiment's been successful, which is great. Let's switch back to our template, and what we want to do here is wait for this to complete. So we set this to run for 3 minutes, so let's just leave this and let it finish. Okay, so that's our 3 minutes up and our experiment has completed successfully. Let's switch back and let's try rerunning our Lambda now. Make sure that it works as we expect. So again, back to the Lambda console, we'll click on test, choose our event, and we can see that again, it's listed our buckets and that the Lambda has completed successfully. So everything is back to normal now. The experiment has finished running, our Lambda runs as we'd expect. So what's happened here? How did this work? Now, we didn't need to change any code in our Lambda itself. What we do is when we configure the Lambda, we tell it to use a Lambda layer. Now, a Lambda layer is a way of loading code or functionality alongside the Lambda code that we defined. If we scroll down, we can actually see this Lambda defined here. So this is the Lambda layer that Amazon have created. And this contains code that interacts with FIS. So when we run our experiment, it can interact with the Lambda code and carry out the actions that we expect it to do. The other thing that we have done as part of this configuration of this is we've added 2 environment variables. Now, if you remember, I said that we needed to create an S3 bucket, and the layer in this Lambda and FIS use that to communicate, pass data backwards and forwards. And you can see that this is defined using a variable called AWS FIS configuration location. And we also have a second environment variable called AWS Lambda exec wrapper. And this specifies where the code is that FIS needs to run. So we add this in addition to our normal Lambda code. We put the Lambda configuration there for the environment variables. We add that layer. And that means that we can put this in place for Lambdas that we already have. We don't need to change the Lambdas themselves. When we run the experiment, that interacts with the layer, and that will carry out the actions that we specify. So we can test how our Lambdas will perform under chaos conditions. That was obviously a very simple walkthrough, but I hope it's demonstrated how you can set up an experiment to test the Lambda. Now, in this case, we used it to introduce a delay. As I say, we were testing it in this case to make sure that our timeout period would have been sufficient. It wasn't. We can also carry out other experiments, so you can introduce unexpected responses. So you can introduce an error response as if your Lambda had failed. And you can see that listed in the FIS documentation, how to carry that out. Okay, well, thank you for your time today. I hope you enjoyed that. Obviously, feel free to get in touch with me. I'll make sure that my contact details are in the video description as well. Any questions, let me know. Thanks again.